The conference room was still warm from the quarterly board meeting when Gerald Sinclair leaned over my desk. With that synthetic practice run smile he usually saves for high-potential college recruits and corporate human resources photo shoots. "You won't need to prepare for tomorrow's client alignment call," he said, tapping a damp coffee ring onto my printed notes. "Chloe will be leading the account from now on. My daughter is ready." He said it with a light, breezy tone, as if we were passing down a family casserole recipe, not a $250 million contract. I did not blink, I did not flinch, and I did not feed his desperate need for a dramatic office scene. I simply reached into my top desk drawer, pulled out the company-issued phone, and placed it gently on the polished mahogany surface. "Everything she needs is in there," I said. He nodded with an air of smug satisfaction, convinced he had just won a major political battle. He took the phone, turned on his heel, and walked out, his chest puffed out like a peacock returning from a successful hunt. Now, for anyone wondering how we arrived at this steaming pile of executive incompetence, let me rewind for a second, just long enough for you to grab your coffee and understand the slow train to nepotism hell. I had been the senior account lead on Apex Bridge Technologies for 6 years. That was 6 years of flying coach to last-minute regional summits, replying to 2 in the morning emails from Lawrence Albright, their demanding chief executive officer, and hand-holding his junior development team through everything from supply chain hiccups to the time their deployment lead crashed the production server during an annual earnings call. I did it all without complaint, and more importantly, I did it without making a single mistake. Apex Bridge was not just another logo on our client list. It was my account, my professional legacy, and my badge of honor in a firm where men of my demographic, 48 years old, single and tired of being labeled as detail-oriented as if it were a physical defect, do not exactly get paraded at shareholder meetings. I had poured my life into that relationship, building a firewall of trust that kept the client loyal through 3 different internal restructurings and 2 major software failures. Gerald Sinclair, however, operated with a very different moral compass. He liked noise, flash, legacy, and corporate posturing. He was the kind of executive who loved using phrases like succession planning and long-term continuity while unwrapping his tuna melt in the break room. And lately, he had been parading his daughter Chloe around the office like she was a Silicon Valley prodigy, instead of someone who had recently asked me what business-to-business sales actually meant. 2 months out of an online sales boot camp, and suddenly she was shadowing my high-level calls and sniffing around my proprietary client decks. I started noticing things. The office copier was mysteriously out of toner every time I needed to print a critical contract amendment. My name was left off calendar invites for meetings I had originally created. Chloe was popping into client communications channels she had no security clearance for, then attempting to gaslight me when I asked why. "Oh, I thought we were collaborating now," she would chirp, tapping her color-coded digital planner as if it held the secrets of the financial universe. Gerald just laughed it off whenever I raised concerns. "She is eager, Walt," he would tell me, patting my shoulder with a heavy hand. "Teach her your magic." My magic, as he called it, was actually 2 decades of raw professionalism, a massive network of industry favors, and a rare ability to disarm executive egos, twice my pay grade. You do not teach that in a week. You earn it through years of dedication. You bleed for it. But Gerald did not care about the work itself. He cared about the credit. To him, I was the scaffolding, invisible, crucial, and completely disposable once the new bricks were laid in place. He wanted his daughter to inherit a polished, self-running machine so he could claim credit for her rapid rise to the executive tier. The turning point was not loud or dramatic. It occurred on a Tuesday at 5:46 in the evening. I was closing up my laptop for the day when an associate named Jordan wandered by my desk. "Hey," Jordan said, pointing at his screen, "Chloe is updating the Apex Bridge portal. She said you were off the account." I stared at him, said nothing, and simply nodded as if I had approved the transition of the most sensitive portfolio in the firm. I checked my inbox. There was no transition document, no formal notice, just a forwarded memo from Chloe titled "Next Chapter." The email opened with an informal greeting about being excited to collaborate and ended with a spelling mistake in Lawrence Albright's name. I did not scream. I did not complain. I poured myself a lukewarm cup of break room coffee, watched it swirl in the mug, and reminded myself of my core rule. Do not give them your anger, give them your silence. It terrifies them far more. By the time Gerald dropped the final hammer on Thursday afternoon, muttering about doing this for long-term alignment, I was already gone in every way that mattered. My loyalty had been packed away the moment Chloe changed my calendar permissions without my consent. All I had left was clarity. So, I smiled, handed over the device, and walked out. They did not know about the personal non-disclosure agreement. They did not know about Clause 3A and how it was structured. They had no idea what Lawrence Albright would do when he realized his trust had been transferred without his written consent. But I did. I walked out of the building into the cool autumn air, feeling the first real sense of relief I had experienced in 6 years, knowing the trap was set. The silence in the office after my departure was exactly what I needed. I spent Friday morning at a quiet diner down the street, enjoying a fresh pot of coffee and watching the rain paint the windows. I was 48 years old, and for the first time in 6 years, I did not have to monitor a live client feed or respond to urgent status alerts. My mind was perfectly calm. I knew that Gerald and Chloe were currently celebrating their corporate takeover, completely unaware of the legal tripwire they had just triggered. They believed they had outmaneuvered me, that they had successfully relegated a senior analyst to the sidelines, while they claimed the credit for our largest contract. Gerald had always loved what he called fireside chats, even though the only fire in our conference rooms was the one burning through the careers of his subordinates. The man was obsessed with corporate metaphors. So when he cleared his throat at the Thursday strategy meeting and tapped his pen against the glass table, I already knew the betrayal was complete. We are making a slight adjustment to the Apex Bridge account, he had announced with a grin that smelled of peppermint and bad intentions. In the spirit of succession planning, Chloe will be stepping into the lead role. Nobody clapped. Everyone in the room knew what Gerald was doing. His daughter was receiving the golden goose, while the rest of the team was left with the administrative scraps. Chloe had beamed, looking as if she had just won a prestigious award for being the most oblivious manager in the industry. When I placed the company phone in front of her, Gerald smiled as if he had just solved middle management. "Thanks, Walt," he said. "I knew you would be a team player." Team player is simply the phrase they use when they have already erased your name from the corporate registry. I watched Chloe fumble with the device, her manicured nails tapping the screen as if it were a foreign object. Her entire client management experience consisted of a group project in business school, where she had taken credit for choosing the presentation font. Gerald had leaned back, looking like a Roman senator handing out provinces to his family. "We believe in developing talent," he had declared, "and Chloe is ready for this exposure." Yes, exposure, I thought, much like an open wound in a dirty room. They had no understanding of the delicate balance of trust required to maintain a client of that scale. I had spent the rest of that Thursday backing up absolutely nothing, deleting nothing, and editing nothing. I wanted every single file, text, and email thread to remain exactly as it was. I had spent 6 years navigating late-night crises with Lawrence Albright without ever dragging the firm's leadership into the mud. Chloe was inheriting a loaded weapon, and I had no intention of safety-checking it on her behalf. By 6 in the evening, the office had begun to empty. A few colleagues offered awkward comments in the elevator about how change is growth, as if I had been gently nudged into a comfortable retirement instead of being publicly sidelined. I thanked them and said nothing. There is a specific kind of silence you master when your professional dignity is being quietly dismantled by a manager who once forgot your name at a holiday party. I sat in my apartment on Friday morning and opened my personal laptop. I did not access the company network. Instead, I pulled up my personal copy of the non-disclosure agreement. It was a document that Lawrence Albright and I had signed 3 years ago in a private conference room during the Chicago summit, following a massive vendor data leak that had nearly ruined his company's merger plans. The document was clear, explicit, and legally binding. One specific line was burned into my memory. All communications between Lawrence Albright and Walter J. Vance shall remain exclusively between the signatories. Any breach of Clause 3A by either party shall void the engagement under Section 7.2. Under established U.S. contract law, a personal service contract containing a personal covenant is non-delegable without the prior written consent of both parties. Any attempt to transfer these duties to an unauthorized third party is void from its inception. I knew Lawrence Albright. He was a strict, no-nonsense executive who had once terminated a public relations firm because they used a generic stock photo in an investor newsletter. He did not tolerate errors, and he absolutely did not tolerate surprises. He valued absolute confidentiality above all else, which was why he had insisted on a personal agreement with me rather than a standard corporate contract. At 10:12 on Friday morning, the first warning shot was fired. I received a notification on my personal email from a shared inbox I still monitored. It was an email from Chloe to Lawrence Albright. The subject line was "Big Vibes Ahead," followed by a rocket emoji. The body of the email was even worse. "Hey, Lawrence. Just wanted to reach out and say I am thrilled to be your new point person. I have been following your brand journey for years, and I am obsessed with your leadership style. Let us grab time next week for a virtual matcha chat." I stared at the screen, letting the pure absurdity of it sink in. A virtual matcha chat with the chief executive officer of a multi-billion-dollar publicly traded corporation. I did not reply. I did not forward it to the legal department. I did not call Gerald to warn him. I simply closed my laptop, poured another cup of coffee, and watched the rain. The dominoes were lined up, and Chloe had just pushed the first one with a digital rocket emoji. The weekend passed in a quiet blur, but Monday morning arrived with a sharp change in the weather. I walked into the office at 8:30, smelling the usual combination of burnt coffee and Gerald's expensive cologne. He was standing near the executive kitchen, talking loudly to one of the operations directors about roadmap strategy and relationship management. He looked completely relaxed, convinced that his daughter's transition to the Apex Bridge account was going perfectly. Meanwhile, Chloe walked past my desk wearing a bright green blazer, humming a tune as she carried a designer bag. She did not look at me, nor did she knock before entering her new office. She was completely oblivious to the legal storm she had set in motion. I sat at my desk and opened my notebook, writing down a simple entry. 9 in the morning meeting, boardroom 3B. I had spent the morning reviewing the contract language and ensuring that my physical files were organized. I knew that the moment Lawrence Albright read that email, the clock had started ticking for Gerald's career. The calendar invite had dropped into my inbox at 8:15. It was an emergency meeting notice marked as high priority. The required attendees were Gerald Sinclair, Chloe Sinclair, legal counsel Sylvia Crane, a second lawyer named Mason, and myself. There was no explanation, no agenda, just a Zoom link and an urgent request for attendance. I knew exactly what it was. The tone of the invite was dry and functional, devoid of the usual corporate fluff that Gerald liked to inject into his communications. When I walked into boardroom 3B at 10 minutes to 9, the atmosphere was frozen. Sylvia Crane was sitting at the table, her glasses pushed up, staring intently at a thick manila folder. Mason was rapidly scrolling through a digital copy of our master service agreement on his laptop. Gerald was pacing near the window, his forced smile completely gone, replaced by a tight, pale expression. Chloe was sitting next to his chair, looking slightly defensive, but still mostly confused. She was tapping her pen against her iPad screen, trying to look busy, but failing to hide the nervous twitch in her posture. "Good. You are here," Gerald muttered when he saw me enter. "Let us keep this collaborative, Walt." I sat down at the far end of the table, unbuttoned my charcoal blazer, and placed my notebook in front of me. I said nothing. I did not offer a polite smile or make small talk. I simply waited for the screen to connect. At 9 in the morning, the Zoom screen flickered to life. Lawrence Albright's face appeared on the display. He was sitting in his minimalist office in New York, the morning sun cutting across the glass panels behind him. He did not smile. He did not offer any pleasantries. His expression was as cold as ice. "Gerald," Lawrence said, his voice flat and cold. "I am here because the email I received on Friday constitutes a direct violation of our personal non-disclosure agreement. Clause 3A is explicit. All communications regarding the roadmap initiatives must remain exclusively between Walter Vance and myself. You authorized an unauthorized third party to contact me. Under Section 7.2 of our agreement, this breach nullifies our engagement effective immediately. The room went dead silent. You could hear the hum of the ventilation system. Gerald blinked, his face turning the color of paper. "Lawrence," he stammered, his voice cracking slightly. "I assumed the agreement was with the company. Walt signed it as an employee. He was grasping at straws, trying to find a loophole where none existed." "It was a personal covenant," Lawrence replied, his tone sharp and final. "We signed it as individuals because the roadmap data is highly proprietary. The agreement explicitly states that any delegation of these duties without my prior written consent is void from its inception. Under the legal doctrine of void ab initio, your attempted transfer of the account to your daughter has nullified the contract. Apex Bridge is withdrawing its $250 million contract immediately. We will be transitioning our operations to a competitor by the end of the month." Gerald turned to Sylvia Crane, his eyes wide with panic. "Sylvia, tell him this is a misunderstanding. We can reassign the lead. We can put Walt back on the account. We can resolve this within the hour." Sylvia Crane did not look up from her folder. She traced a line of text with her pen. "Clause 3A is clear, Gerald," she said, her voice quiet. "There are no amendments on record. The agreement is personal. The delegation is invalid. The contract has been voided by your action." Chloe, now looking terrified, whispered, "What does Section 7.2 mean?" She looked from her father to the legal counsel, her boss vibes completely vanishing. "It means," Lawrence Albright said from the screen, "that all confidential data shared during our engagement is now off-limits for your firm. You cannot reuse, present, or reference any of our product development materials. And for the record, Gerald, you chose nepotism over process, and you have compromised a pending transaction. That is not something you fix. That is something you suffer." Lawrence looked at me on the screen. "Walt, thank you for confirming your status on Friday morning. I will be in touch regarding the transition." Then the screen went black. The silence that followed was absolute. Gerald stared at the empty screen, his hands trembling. Chloe looked at her father, finally realizing the scale of the disaster she had caused. I stood up, closed my notebook, and walked out of the room, leaving them to sit in the ruins of their own arrogance. I walked back to my desk, packed my notebook, and prepared for the next stage of the compliance review. By Saturday morning, the corporate fallout had already begun to shift from a contract dispute into a massive regulatory liability. I was sitting in my kitchen, enjoying a quiet breakfast, when my personal phone buzzed. It was an email from the head of compliance, Miriam Thorne. The subject line was simple: urgent inquiry regarding Apex Bridge NDA appendix. I opened the email and read the message. Miriam was requesting my immediate presence in the office on Monday morning to review the documentation. I replied that I would be available. I then opened a secure folder on my personal drive, containing the scanned files from my years on the account. I knew that the real danger for the firm was not just the loss of the $250 million contract. It was what was buried in Appendix C of the non-disclosure agreement, a section that Gerald had completely ignored in his rush to reassign the account. 3 years ago, during our integration discussions, Lawrence Albright had shared highly sensitive roadmap materials regarding a confidential merger between Apex Bridge and a pre-public biotech firm named Aerogen Diagnostics. This transaction was still in its pre-market phase and had not been disclosed to the public. It was a highly sensitive business deal that had major financial implications for both organizations. The integration process required combining proprietary database structures and sharing source code that, if exposed, could destroy the market value of the upcoming public offering. Aerogen Diagnostics had developed a revolutionary DNA sequencing method that Apex Bridge planned to integrate into their medical delivery platform, creating a massive competitive advantage. Because of my role, I had been the sole gateway for this information. The agreement was structured so that the data could not be shared internally within my firm without my direct verification. It was a security measure designed to prevent information leaks that could affect the valuation of the pre-public firm. The contract was structured to prevent the exact type of internal distribution that Gerald had just executed. The cryptographic keys to access the integration servers were stored securely on my device, requiring my biometric signature for any transfer. I was the human firewall preventing premature market disclosure. However, during my review of the internal files on Friday, I had realized something alarming. Gerald Sinclair, in his rush to present a new precision health initiative to the board, had copied several slides from my secured drive. These slides contained proprietary data models directly linked to the confidential merger with Aerogen Diagnostics. He had assumed that since the files were on my drive, he could freely use them to bolster his presentation and make his division look more innovative than it actually was. He did not know that the slides contained watermarked data tracking tags that linked back to the confidential registry. He had presented this deck to the board of directors during the quarterly meeting, and worse, he had authorized Chloe to upload the materials to a shared corporate portal. This meant that unreleased, highly confidential merger data had been distributed to individuals who had no legal clearance to view it. Under federal securities laws, this constituted a massive compliance failure, with serious risks of insider trading exposure. If any board member or executive had traded stock based on this information, the firm would face severe criminal penalties. I spent 3 hours on Saturday afternoon building a comprehensive 56-page packet. I did not write a narrative of complaint or emotional grievance. I simply compiled the facts, the dates of the NDA, the specific provisions of Appendix C, the access logs showing when Gerald and Chloe had downloaded the files, and the distribution list of the board deck. I included screenshots of the portal upload history, database access logs with my cryptographic markers, and copies of the email correspondence showing Chloe's manual downloads. Under the legal doctrine of breach of fiduciary duty, an officer of a company is required to act in the best interests of the organization and protect its proprietary assets. By bypassing the compliance protocols to promote his daughter, Gerald had breached this duty, exposing the firm to severe regulatory penalties. He had prioritized his daughter's career over the legal safety of the entire corporation, failing in his fundamental duty of care. Furthermore, I prepared a formal whistleblower complaint under Section 806 of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. This federal statute protects employees of publicly traded companies who report internal compliance failures and financial irregularities. By documenting the unauthorized distribution of confidential merger data, I was ensuring that the firm's leadership would have to address the issue directly rather than burying it to protect Gerald. The statute provided me with absolute protection against career retaliation, while forcing the compliance department to report the breach to the Securities and Exchange Commission immediately. I printed 2 physical copies of the complete packet. One I placed in my secure personal files at my home office. The second I locked in a secure safety deposit box at my local bank branch. The metal key was cool in my palm, a solid, tangible weight that represented the finality of my protection. I walked out of the bank branch, knowing that no matter what internal systems were wiped or what pressure was applied by the board, my records were completely secure. By Sunday evening, I felt a quiet sense of readiness. I was not driven by a desire for revenge. I was simply enforcing the boundaries that Gerald had chosen to ignore. He had assumed that my silence was a sign of weakness, but he was about to learn that in a regulated industry, the rules are the only currency that matters. Monday morning arrived with a heavy gray sky. I walked into the building at 8:15, noticing that the usual hallway chatter was completely absent. The employees I passed looked tense, speaking in quiet whispers near the printers. The news of the lost contract had already leaked, and the office was filled with a sense of impending dread. The marketing leads looked pale, and the sales directors were huddled in closed-door meetings trying to salvage their quarterly numbers. At exactly 8:55, I walked down to boardroom 5C. The door was closed, but I could hear voices inside. When I entered, the room was full. Gerald Sinclair was sitting at the table, his eyes bloodshot, his hands clasped tightly. Chloe was beside him, looking down at her lap, her usual confidence completely shattered. Miriam Thorne, the lead compliance officer, was standing at the end of the table next to General Counsel Gwendolyn Frost. CFO Stuart Croft was also present, looking grimly at a stack of financial projections. "Thank you for coming, Walt," Miriam Thorne said, directing me to a seat. She opened the folder on the table. "We are here to review the compliance status of the Apex Bridge account and the potential exposure regarding the proprietary roadmap materials. We have reviewed your packet, and we need to verify the specific details." Miriam pulled out a copy of the non-disclosure agreement, pointing to the signature page. "Walt, can you confirm that this agreement was executed as a personal covenant between yourself and Lawrence Albright?" "Yes," I said, my voice calm and clear. "It was executed 3 years ago to secure the integration data. Under the agreement, any delegation of these duties without prior written consent is invalid, rendering the transition void ab initio. Under established contract principles, when a contract relies on the personal skills or trust of a specific individual, any unauthorized assignment of those obligations is void from its inception. The contract was nullified the moment Chloe contacted him." CFO Stuart Croft leaned forward. "Walt, what is the exposure on the board presentation slides that were distributed last week?" I opened my folder and slid copies of the slide history across the table. "Gerald Sinclair used 3 slides containing data from Appendix C," I explained. "These models are tied to a confidential pre-public merger. By distributing them to the board and uploading them to the portal, the firm has shared unreleased financial data. If any trades were made based on this information, we are facing serious regulatory investigations under federal securities laws. The risk of an SEC audit is extremely high." Gerald stood up, his face red. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "We did not share anything outside the firm. It was an internal presentation. We were showing our capability." He looked around the room, searching for support, but the other executives remained silent. "The agreement explicitly prohibits internal distribution without my verification," Gwendolyn Frost said, her voice cold and cutting. "The moment you deactivated Walt's access and handed the account to your daughter, you violated the personal covenant. Under Section 7.2, Apex Bridge has already terminated the contract, and under our bylaws, by bypassing compliance, you have personally assumed the liability for this breach. Your executive indemnity is revoked." Chloe looked at her father, tears welling in her eyes. "Dad, you said it was fine," she whispered. She looked completely lost, the reality of her professional ruin sinking in. Gerald sank back into his chair, the reality of the situation finally crushing his composure. He had spent his entire career building a reputation for leadership, but he had ruined it in a single week of nepotism and arrogance. He had no defense left. Gwendolyn Frost turned to the room. "The board has held an emergency meeting this morning," she announced. "In light of the compliance failure and the breach of fiduciary duty, Gerald Sinclair is placed on immediate unpaid leave pending the final regulatory inquiry. Chloe Sinclair is removed from all client-facing and operational roles, effective immediately." She then looked at me. "Walt, the board would like to know if you are willing to step back into the lead role to manage the transition and assist with the compliance containment. We are prepared to offer a significant salary adjustment." I looked at Gerald, who was staring blankly at the table, and then at Chloe, who was silently weeping. I then looked at Gwendolyn Frost. "No," I said quietly. "I am declining the offer. I have prepared a formal transition statement and my terms for departure. I will cooperate fully with the regulatory inquiry, but my time with the firm is finished. I have already filed a formal report under Section 806 of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act to protect the integrity of the audit." I stood up, buttoned my blazer, and gathered my papers. I did not look back as I walked out of the boardroom. The hallway was quiet, the air cool. I took the elevator down to the lobby, handed my badge to the security guard, and walked out into the morning air. I had spent 20 years playing by the rules in an industry that often rewarded the loud and the connected. But in the end, the rules had done exactly what they were designed to do. They had protected the integrity of the work, and they had held the arrogant accountable. As I unlocked my car and drove away from the building, I felt a deep, satisfying sense of peace. The corporate tower faded in my rearview mirror, and for the first time in 6 years, the horizon was completely clear. I tuned the radio to a classical station and merged into the morning traffic, leaving the corporate battlefield behind for good.